And next up, we have Henning Deitrich from IBM.
Thank you. So yeah, I think before I even start my talk, I wanted to be a little bit contrarian, because we're hearing a lot about possibilities in the future, and I'm also going to be talking about the future. But as a programmer, sometimes we say there are a lot of ideas, but it's in the implementation. And what we heard today was kind of the opposite, and so I would like to say, well, I would like to remind people that we're here basically because of that awesome invention of the blockchain. And I think many people are here because they heard of the blockchain, they understood the concept and what's so cool about it. And virtual currencies were around like in 2000, but nobody could have figured out what Bitcoin actually was. That had been figured out then 10 years later, and was basically completely about implementation. Like, people knew what they wanted, but there had to be a lucky leap. And without the lucky leap, it was just not possible. And we even had a discussion yesterday whether pouring lots of people on that problem would have helped to actually find the solution, or it just had to have that lucky leap. In the end, it is an implementation, and it has very strong limitations, what we have now, that we would like to find a solution to. But like, we never really found a solution, for example, for the perpetual motion machine. It's not always sure that we're going to find a solution. It's not a given that we're going to find anti-gravity. I hope we will, but to say that's just an implementation problem is one opinion. So I'm going to be talking about Adept. Adept is a concept from IBM to use the blockchain for Internet of Things. And I would like to be very clear about that. This was originally spearheaded by Paul Brody, and now Vina is of the Global Electronics, of the Institute for Business Value, is pushing this concept. So my presentation is taking a lot from a paper that people like to refer to. That is the IBM, the Device Democracy paper. And I'm Henning Deitrich. What I'm referring here to is strictly my opinion. It's not IBM. It's not even the Adept team opinion. And still, my distributed database background, my background in high velocity and in scalability before it came to blockchain is something that might add a perspective that could be valuable, I think. So Adept also comes from the point of view that we're standing at the threshold of a revolution in computing. And that is not only going to be something quantitative, but it's going to be qualitative. Like, in the past, you had an explosion of computing power that was also completely unexpected. When IBM invented the mainframe, they felt like there's maybe 1,000 customers in the world for this kind of computing power. And then when they invented the PC, there was another completely ridiculous forecast. I think it was like 50,000 was what the market, the estimated market was for PC sales. So we all know it didn't turn out that way. Those markets turned out to be much bigger. But now we're going to see a much bigger market yet, where something like farming, where it was never practical that you have your desktop or even your laptop with you, is just going to be an IT profession like any other, because it's going to be with smartphones and drones and other devices that are going to be developed within the next years. And that's pretty clear, I think. There's no question there that this is going to be implemented. Now, the first wave of IoT is already here, and it's a billion of things, and they're all connected with each other. There are success stories, like, for example, jet engines, which are sending home information 24/7, and when a plane gets lost, like the Malaysia Air planes, then we had the case where the jet engines are actually the last data points that could be traced, because they kept sending their data to the satellites till the last moment. On the other hand, where it didn't really catch on was certainly in the consumer market, where still only 10% of TVs are used to access the internet, and expectations had been much higher in that regard. But it turns out that people are not convinced they actually really need an intelligent toaster or have their alarm clock talk with their TV. So the market expectations and valuations are a little bit interesting. So you still have expectations of revenue to grow 10 to 20 times just by making things intelligent. You have startups. I mean, Nest is certainly a success story. I mean, no doubt about that. But it's not always clear what these expectations are actually based on. Of course, there's the exciting stuff, the self-driving car of the future that is then also tapping into the blockchain, is self-owned, and is actually a corporation to itself as a new incarnation of Uber that we might all see in the future. I mean, it seems like it's around the corner when a couple of things are going to come together. But then the present that we actually have is really a centralized world where Internet of things talk to a central server, and that is then something that, for example, where I work, Cloudant at IBM, where we do a database as a service that does huge scalability, and it makes things possible for startups that were not possible in the past, but it's centralized. It's something that all has this notion of the cloud as something that lives in the servers. And I don't think that's going to go away. That's going to stay with us, because whenever you need something that has to be huge and available and maintained by experts, then yeah, you use something like Cloudant, and that's what you want to do. And there is still going to be a development, and that is in the moment a clash of worlds, also within IBM, where the decentralization is actually going to lead us. And if we look at Adept, then there's certainly a guiding idea there, a vision, where the idea is to give the ownership to the device and to talk and discuss why that is exactly how the future can be shaped, and why that is how the Internet of Things can be successful and grow to what we think the scale will be. That's what I'm going to try to present here. So another thing, though, with implementation is that we're all talking about scales of billions and trillions of things, but just to have a blockchain that would accommodate the tens of billions of things that are going to talk to each other in the future, we don't actually have the technology. And scaling is a hot topic that is discussed within the Bitcoin community, within Ethereum. There are papers going around, there are proposals being made, there's optimism, there's pessimism, but it's not solved. And some are optimistic it's going to be solved, but until we have it, or the lucky invention has happened, that like the double spending prevention in Bitcoin, we're not actually at a point where we could say this is something that we could base a product on and sell to customers, and that's what's important for IBM. So we have to be realistic, where we're actually standing right now, what Ethereum, once it comes out, will actually be able to provide. And at this point, to me personally, it doesn't look like we're going to have one global blockchain that all these things can talk to, just because even if we would like to, we can't. It's at this point not possible yet. Still, no matter what the actual implementation is, how the devices will talk to each other, there's something emergent that is called a device, or can be called a device democracy. And that will see a decentralization of the power and of the guardianship over the data, moving away from single points of failure, of course, and moving away from architectures that, let's face it, are also great for surveillance. And if a company has the data from everybody that's using their products, of course, the government's going to go to them. And if there's a necessity, or even no terrorism attack yet, but something that looks like a danger, the government will make sure that it really does everything it can, and when it can, it might seize the data from this central storage. So there's an inherent weakness of the whole Internet of Things concept like it's done in the moment, and that we don't own our mobile phones anymore, basically, and that so much stuff is going into the cloud and out of our immediate control might bite more and more people. Like, it was predictable that people would ruin their careers using Facebook, but only after it happened a couple of times and after friends heard from friends who were actually affected did it really catch on that you should have, as an immediate means of damage control. You should not just post anything to Facebook that comes to mind. So in the same way, we're going to see these kind of soft factors becoming more and more important, I believe, in how architectures and how products are going to be shaped. Because if your intelligent toaster is just good for spying on you, but not really giving you too much benefit on the other side, it's just not going to happen. People are not going to use it. What we're going to see, I think, is that we will have a device philosophy, so to say, that is an autonomous device, and with a blockchain as the universal ledger that is facilitating a kind of commerce between those devices that are part of that ecosystem of the device democracy. So devices could start trading with each other, and they could start making intelligent decisions using electricity in a wise way, or they could start to send information to each other in a way that makes sense and doesn't clog up the information lines that they have available. So one other problem that we have to face as a company is that even when there was a successful presentation now in January where Adept was demonstrated as a product and used a example that I will explain a little later, there's still a question, how can, in the future, Adept be something that makes money? Because after all, IBM likes to enable their customers, and there's an interesting angle here that is also an emergent feature, and that is about who is going to say what smart contracts are actually trustworthy. And that's an angle that's also something that we're looking at, where this kind of signature that has, for example, a central place in the Ethereum architecture can be something that is essential to a future business model for Adept. So if we look at the problems that we're facing when something that is now 1 billion devices is scaling to hundreds of billion devices as is forecast, then we can see 5 problems. So for one, solutions that work on a certain scale might not work on a certain other scale, especially if it's as high as 100 billions. If you have hundreds of billions of devices, then connecting them to each other, or even connecting them all to a central entity and to central cloud, can be quite expensive. So on the one hand, you have the cost of the centralized infrastructures and server farms. Then on the other hand, you have the cost of support of all these devices. Then the internet is not a place of trust anymore. It certainly started out with email being communication between nerds, and it didn't need much protection, but then later the reality took over, and now we can't really use email anymore without spam. But that's just a very benign example where if you start to have your doorknob being part of the Internet of Things and online, then if somebody hacks that, it has immense consequences. And the price of a doorknob, even if it's intelligent, that is actually safe enough to protect your home and at the same time add some value, is something that has to be found out. Smart devices also need to be managed for the long haul. A toaster is expected to last for 10 or 20 years, much longer than a mobile phone. There are other things like metro cars that are expected to last for 50 years, and there's even other long-range devices that are completely low cost, but if you want to make them intelligent, you would have to support them for an extremely long time. And finally, simply making something intelligent and connected doesn't automatically make it a better product. I mean, what is it really that your toaster could benefit from being wired? Could give you advertisement burned into your toast, but where's the benefit for you? So profit will remain elusive if companies will cling to old business models, and especially if the first thought is advertisement, like Google demonstrates can be very successful. The question still becomes, all the devices in your household spy on you and collect data upon you. At a certain point, they'll become incredibly redundant. And if there's competition, then usually what happens is, in the end, the money goes to the intermediary, not to the device manufacturers. So that's the real problem where a new business model has to be found that is not going to be just scaling what we have now. So in the end, it's a lot about really thinking hard and having a clear shared approach and really understand what really makes devices better when they become part of the Internet of Things. So it really has to be increased safety or better cooking or improved reliability. It can't just be, yeah, now it's intelligent and now it's cooler. So to be secure and scalable, there's a certain number of attributes that an Internet of Things needs to have. And unsurprisingly, that's why I'm here, we found that the blockchain is giving us a lot of the stuff that we actually need. So a truly decentralized Internet of Things would have 4 foundational functions, and that's trustless peer-to-peer messaging, distributed file sharing, autonomous device coordination, and identity. And it would also have to have 3 foundational transactions that should be supported that are in sync with that. It's peer-to-peer messaging, distributed file sharing, and device coordination. IBM demonstrated exactly that at the CES in January with a washer, the Samsung washer, that was able to automatically order its detergent and was able to automatically order service so that it basically could function completely autonomously. If the detergent level falls under a certain level, and then the demonstration showed how a warning popped up, you just confirm it, and it automatically goes out on the blockchain and buys detergent and has it delivered. So yeah, I won't go into the detail here. It's pretty obvious what happens. But a more interesting example and complementary to that is that it could also order its own service. So in the end, basically the washer can do everything that it needs to keep functioning. It can have itself repaired, it can resupply itself, it can inform you about what it actually does right now. It could even negotiate with your TV about when it should use electricity and when it should wait because the TV is used. Another example that was demonstrated was by Samsung, and they demonstrated a decentralized Adcast, where users were able to tap into a net where they are offering advertisement space, and then somebody else who wants to have an advertisement displayed could tap into that market, and there was an automatic bidding system, and the advertisement would automatically ferry to the point where it's needed to be displayed. And you would use the blockchain to have contracts between the individual players and have payment. So this is the technical architecture of Adept. The interesting part here, because we are talking about blockchain, is the open source protocols layer that is in the moment based on Ethereum and on Telehash and BitTorrent. The interesting part here is that Ethereum is obviously growing towards a more important role here because they are implementing, they're basing parts of their new Swarm and Whisper stuff on BitTorrent and Telehash. So that is going to become an even more integrated part of Ethereum, of Adept at that point, where it's really encompassing the whole protocol layer. And I find it super interesting that in a certain way you could say there's so much convergence between Adept and Ethereum because the same problems have to be solved, basically. I really wonder how close the dovetailing might be there in the future. Yeah, in closing, I think what's super exciting to go forward is that probably we're going to develop a completely different attitudes towards the things that we're going to use. Like people probably won't pony up $400 or $1,000 up front to buy a washer that they then use only 10% of its lifetime. But they will probably just pay money into a budget that is then the washer budget, and that is what is renting a washer that stands somewhere close, hopefully, but also is able to buy its detergent and its service and everything itself and maintain itself. So there was a couple of nice press releases. This will probably be online. This is why I put the links there. And yeah, I would close with questions to the audience. That's good, because we're out on time. Okay, one question.
So with the wash example, the wash, as well as the email example, we haven't gotten those things
So the question was, why is that more secure using the blockchain than... Right.
Today's models have failed in these areas of security and automation.
I'm not sure actually today's models have failed. They haven't caught on as much as people wanted, and they have problems maybe with cost, but there will always be areas where it's very strong how it's done today with centralized databases and clouds. On the other hand, why the blockchain can be more secure, and that's inherent in the actual architecture of a blockchain, how it facilitates transactions. So if you are talking about the protocol level, certainly, I mean, if you use the Ethereum blockchain or if you use the Bitcoin blockchain, you should be damn sure that this is actually secure and not having a huge bug. This is why Bitcoin is developing so slowly, and Ethereum in the moment is so cautious in going forward and spending so much money on security audits. But on a general level, where you talk about the devices, and you certainly need a hardware protection for the identity of the device, where the private key has to be protected in a way that it cannot be extracted, that is all problems that are being addressed in the architectures that we're having right now. So I'm not sure that we really see a situation where past efforts have failed because of security, but we certainly see a situation where the protocols have to be very safe going forward. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think now we're going to have a panel.